You're listening to the 2018 Nelson Arts Festival Page and Blackmore Readers and Writers Program. This session features Rajorshi Chakraborti in conversation with Kerry Sunderland.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hello, welcome. My name is Kerry Sunderland and I'm the coordinator of the Readers and Writers Program. It's much more relaxed doing the introduction sitting down, I must say. I've been standing up the last few. Thank you all very much for coming along this afternoon. A big thank you to our sponsor, Page and Blackmore, who have a wonderful bookshop over there, and you will be able to buy copies of Raj's book and get him to sign them after this session. And as a housekeeping, please turn your phones off or pop them on silent. We are recording this session and it will be available as a podcast afterwards. And for that reason, when we do questions towards the end of the session, if you could please wait for the microphone to arrive before you ask your question, that'd be great for the recording. Hello, Raj.
Hi, Kerry. Thank you so much for having me. Kia ora, everyone, and delighted to be here.
So I've just got a wee introduction to Raj, and I'm particularly interested in leading into with the questions of what has inspired Raj as a writer. So Raj was born in Calcutta, but now calls Wellington home. He's the author of 5 novels and numerous short stories, including Knock Knock, which won the Sunday Star Times Short Story Award in 2011. So while he may appear to be a new name in New Zealand literature, you can see he's been here observing and absorbing Kiwi culture for a decent number of years now, I think. And I asked Raj what has influenced his writing, and he nominated true crime as a genre, and within that, an Indian TV show called Crime Patrol. But if he had to name just one writer who has had the most influence on his work, it would be Franz Kafka. But I wanted to start by asking you about Crime Patrol. Tell us a little bit about Crime Patrol and how it's found its way into the way you approach storytelling.
Yeah, so sorry for naming a show probably most of you won't have heard of or watched, but many of you will be familiar with different true crime shows or documentaries or books. But no, Crime Patrol entered my life. I can actually date it. It's actually a daily show on a very mainstream channel. The channel itself is very ratings driven, as commercial TV channels are in India and anywhere. So it's a kind of double miracle that it exists, and it's a true crime show run by a very dedicated team who kind of turn into stories, things that they've dug out of police cases, and they kind of turn it into narrative, rather. And my mother, who's been a crime true and invented aficionado her entire life, and has passed that on to me, my mother put me onto the show about 5 years ago, and really, I have not been able to give up watching. I would call it, it's akin to the discovery of Shakespeare for me, or, it's because what it has amounted to, what it has built up to over the 5 years that I've been watching it, what boggles the mind is that this is all on commercial TV, as I said, what it has built up to in a country where there are so many pressures acting on the media, as we currently have in India. We have a very right-wing government, where we are also a people who are often hesitant to talk about many of our problems and issues in public. We're a conservative society who like to keep up appearances in various areas. So what this show has built up to is the most extraordinarily unsparing, hard-hitting portrait, a dynamic portrait of who we really are as a national people in India, what we do to one another, what we endure from one another, the extraordinary amounts of violence that are just part of our collective shared life, but also within our domestic life, and above all, perhaps, how much of that violence keeps coming back to that one dimension of our national life, which is our attitudes to gender. So gender-related violence takes such profound and diverse forms in India, and there is no richer, deeper, starker, sadder spotlight cast on that in my lifetime than this popular TV show. And I can give you an example of one storyline. I mean, if people have the time and, but this is not made up by me, but it's a story, it's not one in the book or anything, but it's just to give you one example of how true crime can just, leave your jaw, it can just drop your jaw and also bring so many themes together in one kind of narrative thread. So there's one story, which just one of many that stay in the mind, is of this girl of very, very working class parents. Her father is actually a vegetable vendor with a movable trolley, and he goes through neighborhoods selling vegetables. But the parents were trying their best to give her an education, but they were also quite strict with her, which is why, not because they couldn't afford it, but because they were strict with her, they never allowed her a mobile phone, even though she's about 16 and 17. And even in India, at all ages now, it is more or less affordable to give your child a mobile phone. But they were quite strict with her and didn't do so, which is one of the reasons why she becomes attracted to this boy, who's a little bit older than her, got a bit of charisma. He used to kind of wait on this route through which she cycled to and from high school. And one of the main reasons they kind of hit it off is that he works as an assistant in a mobile phone shop, and using photocopied ID papers of some other customer, he's able to get her a secret phone with a SIM card, and she, for the first time in her life, has a smartphone. That's the heart of the attraction between boy and girl, and they start to have they start to have a relationship. At one point, they decide, or she thinks they have decided, to run away from home and kind of make their life together, even though they're only 17. And in India, the legal age of marriage for a girl is 18, and for a boy is 21, or a young man is 21. And there are historical reasons why they're different, and arguable, whatever. But that's not. So she thinks they're running away from home. What he wants to do, we later realize, is just basically get in the sack with her. But he's kind of gone along with, yes, we're running away from home to make our lives together in love, permanent love. So they kind of head off to an older friend's house, and they kind of, he gets what he wants. She willingly gives it to him. But now he realizes the seriousness with which she is planning for what the next steps will be. And he starts chatting with this older friend of his, who's in his late 20s or so. And he's like, man, I just want to get her off my back. I wasn't planning for all this. I want to get back to my job and whatever. She's just one girl among many, but, she just really latched on to me because I got her this phone, and, I'm a bit older and I'm kind of like charismatic or whatever. But basically what happens is, like, the older friend, first of all, and so this is what I mean, attitudes to gender beginning to come out. The older friend, essentially, while this girl is kind of taking shelter in their house, the older friend just takes the opportunity, and his younger friend allows him to just rape her. He rapes her. Then he thinks, well, she's here now. While we plan for something, how can we monetize her? How do we monetize it? We could actually, I could let some people know, and they could, and that's why I should have warned that maybe you need strong stomach for this story, because all of it's true. But so I really apologize for anyone shocked or triggered in any way. But as it happens, his wife, the older friend's wife, is a pharmacist. With some, because she's a pharmacist, she has some knowledge of drugs and medication. When she comes home in the evening, he asks her for medication that would either kind of excite this girl more and make her more amenable to the idea of being used and raped by multiple customers from whom he would charge money, or to knock her out, go the Bill Cosby route knock her out and use her in that way. And basically, the wife of this man becomes complicit and then kind of finds these drugs from her store and knocks her out, and he goes out to put out the word among he drives, I think he's a taxi driver, so among cab drivers and their friends, basically there's a girl in our house, if you're not doing anything this evening, come along. And this is happening 24 hours after this girl has run away from home. After an evening of doing this, he starts to become a bit frightened because he notices neighbors kind of like looking and saying, why is there a line of strangers sitting on the bench outside their house? Then it strikes him, someone might go to the police, and actually, this plan I have of making money has its dangerous side as well. So now what do we do with her? Now maybe we won't do this in our house. What do we do with her? We've still got to get rid of her. Now we've done this. So we can't just let her head off. And then it happens, they're like, what do we do with her? And they get a visit from one of the cab drivers in the taxi rank where he hangs out and where earlier he'd put out the word. There's this cab driver who happens to be from Rajasthan, which is in northwestern India. Just to give you a sense of where that is, Rajasthan is in northwestern India. All of this is happening in Karnataka, which is in southern India, maybe about between 1,800 to 2,000 kilometers away. And this guy is a long-distance driver who's heard about this girl, and he's come along to this house. And the guy's like, and he at first thinks he's going to be a customer, and he says, look, man, actually I'm not doing that anymore, so I'm sorry. And he says, no, I've not come for that, but I've heard that you have a girl. I'm actually here to offer you a much larger sum of money if you're interested in hearing out my proposition. And he goes, what's your proposition? And he goes, I want to buy her off you, because what he's from Rajasthan, which is a state where the prejudice against having a girl child is so great that along with a couple of other states, it's the state where the sex ratio is dangerously low now. We've got about 633 girl children who are allowed to be born, as opposed to having feticide committed upon them, who are allowed to be born for every 1,000 boys. So now what that has led to is that it's led to this enormous, apart from various social consequences, it's led to this enormous disparity at the time of when there are young people who want to have girlfriends or get married. There's no one to marry. So it's actually led to this massive trafficking market for girls from other parts of India to be trafficked to Rajasthan to be married off. And this taxi driver from Rajasthan sees that opportunity. He can buy this girl for 90,000 rupees, which is about $2,000 New Zealand, and then go up there and sell her for twice as much. And these people suddenly have a problem off their hands, 90,000 rupees in cash, which they'll divvy up amongst themselves, and they sell her off. And what's really amazing is when the police make their way, the Karnataka police down south, make their way to this friend's house, this friend and his pharmacist's wife present themselves as humane and humanitarian in the solution that they came up with. Because, A, of course, they could have just killed her, and B, they almost treated her as if she was a daughter of theirs, because after she'd been raped, she would have had a lot of trouble getting married. And they actually sent her off to a faraway state where no one would know her story, and she would have found a husband, So what happens is, anyway, the police are able to track this person to Rajasthan. They're able to track the cab driver, and through the cab driver, they're able to track the home into which this 17-year-old girl, who 4 days ago had run away with her beau, and all think, on a completely different level, has in 4 days' time has been trafficked into forced marriage in another state in India where they speak a completely different language, 2,000 kilometers away. And that is the scale of story. That is the scale of exposing us to ourselves, who we are, what happens amongst us and around us. That is just one example of a crime patrol story. And which is why after every one of them, this would have been about a 90-minute episode, you feel as though you've been exposed to one of the darkest, richest novels, you know, that you can even think about in the thread that unspools of this girl's journey from conservative parents to wanting a mobile phone to how her boyfriend and then his friend abuse and exploit her, to the trafficking market from Rajasthan with its own reasons, reaching out, picking her up. And in Rajasthan, you know, what's really interesting in Rajasthan is that they're like, you know, we bought her and she's the bride of our home now, you know, and it's just so.
And her parents were probably left behind for some time, having no idea what happened to her.
Exactly.
Which is also something that has actually inspired, coming back to your book, it has inspired this story as well, didn't it? Because it was an event in your own family, a mystery that you wanted to investigate and solve, that sent you on a path of uncovering these things and small and large decisions that unfolded to lead into this story. Can you talk a little bit about what happened in your own family and how that led you to write?
Absolutely,
this book?
yes.
Yeah.
And the weird thing is, what happened in my own family, I kind of told this story, this particular story in a much fuller way at Christchurch, but it's actually not that dissimilar the story was inspired by me originally wishing to write a non-fiction account of an aunt of my father's. My father is one of 10 siblings. And one of his sisters, an aunt of mine, a sister of my father's, one of his 3 sisters kind of basically disappeared. She was the mother of 3 children, and as the story goes, she made lunch boxes, or what we call tiffin boxes in India. On the morning that she was about to disappear, she made lunch boxes for her children, sent them off to school, saw them off on the bus, and this was an afternoon in 1992, and my cousins are kind of my age, either side of 40, and have never seen their mother again to this day, you know, and kind of don't know what happened to her. And it was this aunt's story, this kind of incredible darkness around this aunt's story that originally made me want to write a non-fictional account. But then what happened was, events spiraled out of my control in actually a weirdly good way. Me beginning to do the research for that non-fiction book actually kind of unlocked weird things within both my parents and other people in my family, and led to a lot of people coming together and talking for the first time, and people who'd not spoken in years. And suddenly I realized that I wanted to write as complex and truthful, or as complex a non-fiction book, raising as many sides to as many truths as I could. But suddenly I realized that if I were to do that, I could either write the most complex book I was capable of, but by doing that, I would risk damaging this incredible new wave of family reconciliations and people coming together that had inadvertently begun. And so suddenly I was left with this story, but I couldn't tell it in the way that I wanted to. And for a while I was actually quite depressed, because I felt like, you know, a writer who just lost a story, who has 40,000 words worth of notes and interview transcripts. Until being a novelist who had published 4 novels earlier, the solution of what if I were to novelize it? What if fictionalizing key aspects of it allowed me to come at those parts of the truth that I most wanted to explore and get more deeply into? What if the novel could be my pretext to kind of approach those? And the other benefit of, once I decided to turn it into a novel, I also did this 2 other things that were interesting to do, which is, instead of making people in my parents' generation, relatives of my parents' generation, the focus of some of my most hard-hitting questions that I had for them. I kind of turned a character based very closely on me into the focus of those same questions within the novel, because a novel allows you to do that. It allows you to pursue a what might have been path rather than a what actually happened path. And then the other wonderful thing it allowed me to do was, this was all happening in India and had all happened in India, all of this family history, which I could bring into the book. But once I'd given myself the permission to turn it into a novel, I could also bring in the New Zealand part of my life. This incredibly transformative period that I've spent in this country over the past 8 years, transformative most of all because these were the years in which I became a parent for the first time. My partner and I became parents, and I became a stay-home parent, which was transformative in another further way. So it allowed me to weld both of these stories I wanted to tell. The story of the last few years in New Zealand, and this other very kind of powerful and mysterious story of this disappeared aunt.
And obviously, one of the key questions you had for Abhay, is that how you pronounce it? Abhay? 'Cause that's how I've been pronouncing it in my mind, was, and which is in the title of the book, is, how do we fail to see things and notice things that, and how do we go back to things and understand more about them? So that was obviously a very key question you had for your character that drew from your own experience and your own family. What were some of the other questions that you wanted to explore as through your protagonist? Yeah.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I think probably above all to convey in this, is the notion of, especially because he lives, the two main characters, Abhay and Lena. Lena's kind of Pakeha Kiwi, and who is Abhay's reason for living in New Zealand. Because they live here, and then Abhay's brother Ashim comes in from India with this massive amount of unresolved family history that he seems determined to make Abhay confront. I guess one of the other things I kind of was most keen to bring out was the notion of Abhay and Lena, that complexity, once you choose to notice it, complexity is simultaneous and relentless. That once you actually choose to look at everything you've turned away from, or things that you've turned away from, it doesn't mean that other parts of your life that exert its demands on you temporarily give you a respite. So, just because Abhay begins to face up to huge things from his past and huge things from the Indian part of his life, it does not mean that the New Zealand part of his life, his immediate family, and the demands on him as a partner and as a father, as a parent, cease. So one of the things the book is very much about is about kind of running on several treadmills at the same time, or being pulled in different directions by different, equally legitimate, complex demands, and what that might feel like, and our great existential and shared, perhaps to varying degrees, existential incompetence in coping with such complexity, which then one of the strategies many of us evolve, and Abhay definitely does, as do I, is of kind of selective blinkering. And what we choose to look at, those obligations, those relationships, those faces and their legitimate demands upon us that we choose to look at and acknowledge and respond to, and others that from various kinds of necessity we look away from. And in a place like India, where, one of the things that the book is also about, which makes it kind of political with perhaps a small p, is that in a place like India, especially if as a visitor, and Kerry's been, if you go for the first time, there are Indians themselves who'll advise you that don't try to take in every contradiction, every stark inequality you will notice all around you. You will not be able to cope. You have to kind of say, this is a part of this landscape, and you have to selectively engage with it. And one of the interesting things about the way we Indians cope with India is to the varying extents to which we selectively block out different parts of our enormous, intricate, crazy reality that, we kind of walk through a street and people just kind of block out very stark sights. And becoming people who would not see becomes a kind of existential strategy for coping with this reality. But then what happens when it becomes second nature? What happens when these lives just start to become invisible to you? And also what happens when the structure of privilege and good fortune that your life and its assumptions are built on also become invisible to you? So that a lot of that is kind of what the book is about.
Yeah. And that juxtaposition of New Zealand life with Indian life. I mean, I often think, when I think of India and my 2 trips there, it's like going to another planet.
Yeah.
And in some ways, New Zealand and India are almost polar opposites. They can't be any more different than any other 2 countries on the planet, perhaps. So you do that very well in showing that, but also having Lena's point of view in the story gives you a real opportunity to show how Abhay is not only doing that about his past, but perhaps he's also doing it a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit more about why you decided to tell a lot of the story from Lena's point of view?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, Lena, the kind of Kiwi, the Kiwi wife, is very much she's the second narrator, and very much an unsung hero of the book, because she's the one whose life has suddenly been disrupted by this enormous kind of amount of the past that she didn't know about or happened well before she met Abhay, just kind of erupting into their lives in New Zealand, in Wellington, from India, and how she kind of tries to interpret, understand, be sympathetic to, contain in her view. So she provides that external perspective into this kind of Indian psychodrama that's happening in her family. But the other thing, I completely agree. One of the things, it was at the Wellington festival called Lit Crawl last year. One of the things I was asked to speak about at an event, it was called A Stranger Comes to Town. And it was about different people amongst us, all of whom happened to be writers, who'd all moved to Wellington from very different places and talked about the distance we'd traveled, not just the physical distance, the emotional distance, and in some ways the cultural and civilizational distances we travel every time we navigate these 2 homes of ours, Wellington in New Zealand, or New Zealand and our whatever our other home. And one of the things I always say is that not only is exactly what Kerry said, not only is New Zealand at a great physical distance from India, I really don't think, and I've lived away from India for 24 years, including 14 years in the UK. And one of the things I would say is that New Zealand is actually much further away from India in some ways, attitudinally and civilizationally, than Britain is. Because, one of the ways in which Britain is kind of closer on the spectrum to India, which, although they are different, Britain is an old country. And so, for example, one of the things that Britain understands, unfortunately, all too well, and still remains, unfortunately, all too well ingrained within British life, is awareness of hierarchy. And there's still a notion that different people are born to different stations and might go on to do different things, or if you sound a certain way, you might be this sort of person. There's all of these, there's British people joke about this, that other people don't understand, that when they meet one another, especially in a foreign setting, for the first 10 seconds, they're sussing out, what school you went to, which part of town you lived in, what kind of background you have, in a way that other people, but all of that is very recognizable to us in India. You could not imagine a more hierarchy-aware society, a society in which we are aware of one another. We draw visible and invisible clues from one another, from dress, from accent, from your surname, about your caste, your class, your education level, and all of that, unfortunately, very often feeds into the way we kind of behave. And you see Indians doing this extraordinarily. So, for example, you meet Indians of a progressive bent of mind, people who would think of themselves as progressive. It's extraordinary to watch. So they're talking to someone else that they consider an equal, and about very noble progressive things, and they're talking, and like there's a tone of voice and stuff, and that person, I've seen it myself, that person will suddenly kind of call out for a glass of water from the domestic help, and their attitude and their voice will immediately change because they're talking to someone who's a domestic help, right? And what's even more amazing is and then they'll go back to talking about Marxism and a classless future, gender, whatever. And what's even more amazing is that the glass of water is there, the household help is doing something there, and they are sitting here. So, and so when I say the attitudinal difference between New Zealand, like one of the unfortunate ways in which I inherit one aspect of this Indian, this thing, is an utter uselessness at DIY. Like I think in my 8 years in New Zealand, I've been once inside Mitre 10,
Wow.
and, it's like, and one of the things that's really interesting is because in India, when I can change a light bulb, and I can water plants, but but anything more than that at home, in my defense, you just call someone, and they are really good at it. That's what they do. It's very affordable, and every family, every middle class, but not just middle class family, is surrounded by a constellation of people without whom our lives could not function. Not just the domestic help, but the plumber, the electrician, the whatever, and all of these people are just there, right? And I think so one of the things I talk about is attitudinally, about as far away as you can travel, is New Zealanders' attitudes to one another, no matter what signal they're getting about how eminent they are, or how well-known they are, or how, well-placed they are professionally, or what they do. At least the surface behavior, there's a great pride taken here in the surface behavior, at least, despite widening income inequality or whatever, the surface behavior should at least appear to be egalitarian. When the tone of voice you take and how you behave with someone and the kind of the respect you have for what they do. And also New Zealanders' attitudes towards, if there's something doing, you just kind of muck in and do it, Whereas in India, it's kind of like, you eat and then you put your plates there, and then an invisible someone that just will kind of spirit it away and wash it. And that's so I often talk about attitudinally, I feel like Britain is somewhere in the middle, and I used to live there, and then there's India and New Zealand, and they could not be as far apart. Another way in which that difference makes itself felt, which is one of the reasons, it was kind of came up in our morning conversation, which is one of the reasons we choose to live here and raise our daughter here, relates to what I spoke about earlier, which is issues to do with gender and growing up in India. I mean, there are millions of parents raising wonderful girl children in India, but given a choice, given that my wife Sasha and I are fortunate enough to have 2 homes to choose from, we want our daughter to grow up in a place where there are virtually no ceilings over her head or over her sense of what she can be, what it is to be a she, and what possibilities are open to her. And then we want her to be introduced to India gradually and navigate it in her own way, So
I think those differences are very stark, but what your book did for me was actually make me think about how it could be a critique of the middle class here in New Zealand or in Australia, where I'm from, and how even to some extent not seeing is essential for any sort of middle class or someone with privilege to survive.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how it plays out in the story of Abhay and Lena in New Zealand itself?
One thing that, the model for the Pakeha wife in the book is my Pakeha wife. And Sash, and one of the things she read about and pointed out is one of the interesting things is, just to pick out one small political theme with, like I said, a small p, is she said, what she found, and I hadn't really thought about that at all, but she felt it in the book, is for Abhay, all of the things that his brother from India is accusing him of are, in a way, the sins of their father. An earlier generation, mistakes often made by undoubted, undeniable mistakes made by an earlier generation, from which one brother has enormously benefited as things played out, and another brother kind of suffered and had setbacks in his life. But Abhay has kind of like benefited consciously and unconsciously from those advantages, consolidated them, and they've both reached their present stations in life. And one of the things, Sasha said to me and kind of connected it to people who, there's one of these kind of weird mirrors of society is, I apologize to anyone among here, but is weird mirrors of society are the self-selecting groups of people in different cities or in every city who are very frequent writers of letters to the editor. Like it's a self-selecting group, and it gives you a kind of skewed picture of what that city thinks, because it's actually these people who choose to write in all the time, and it's actually their views. But one of the interesting things Sasha said about, for example, there was a period where people who are frustrated with the slowness of progress on treaty settlement issues in New Zealand, and why are these issues still alive for us? These are sins of the father. They're things of the earlier generation. Why can't we be race blind now? Why can't we draw a starting line now and all line up at that starting line as though we are all equal and run the race? On what, to my mind, is a level playing field or a level running track. And and very much in the book, my wife noted that attitude in Abhay, which is, why is all this being visited? I was a child when all this happened. Why are the sins of the structural inequalities that get compounded into permanent advantages that then draw you apart further and further happen within this family? And Sasha found that to be very relevant to New Zealand, and how for certain sections, I'm trying to be, within inverted commas, race blind in my daily interactions. Why are these issues still being kept alive now? Why is there this grievance industry and this? So she found that to be just one example.
Yeah.
So,
how does the story explore how actions or inaction speak louder than words? Because I think that's a really big part of it too. So, being your narrator, Abhay, is a writer like you.
Yeah.
So he finds his way through the world with words, but it's actually some of the, Ashim, his brother, it's about all the actions that he didn't take. Yeah,
very much.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's another way in which Abhay, the much more comfortably ensconced middle-class person for whom the cards have fallen really well, excuses himself, which is, it's much easier for us within our families and just in nature, it's much easier for us to overlook, within inverted commas, sins of omission than sins of commission. And that's very much what Abhay does. It's like all of the things, his life is built on looking away and on confirming to himself that at various points he didn't do anything wrong, except over time the looking away amounts to the great wrong. And I think that whereas Ashim is the impatient brother who's come from India, is much more someone who triggers things, who can in the beginning at least, appears quite clearly to be villainous and full of malice. And one of the things I'm really interested in as a person is thinking about sins of omission, which is, there's this wonderful passage in an article by Coetzee, J.M. Coetzee, the South African Nobel laureate who lives in Adelaide. In an essay he writes on Saul Bellow's early fiction. And one of Bellow's early books is called The Victim. And it's this kind of really amazing book about this guy, this anti-Semite, who shows up on the doorstep of a stranger who happens to be Jewish, Asa Leventhal, and basically accuses him, Leventhal, of being responsible in some obscure way from something in the past of everything that went wrong in this guy's life. And Leventhal doesn't remember ever meeting him or whatever. But this guy is just like, you said this at that party, and from then on, my life spiraled out of control, and I'm kind of homeless and whatever now, and I'm on your doorstep. And Leventhal kind of takes him in, and the story carries on from there. But one of the interesting things that Coetzee talks about, which is always stayed with me in reading this book, Coetzee says, once you've, and I think about this as a parent, and I think about this as a member of society, and I have to say, my actions fall far short of my thinking in this respect. Which is once you've understood something, or another dimension of something has become apparent to you, what is the imperative on you of action? Like, you comprehend something, and in your mind you exercise understanding and compassion. But to what extent are you then, your enhanced understanding, to what extent does it oblige us to act? And of course, I like playing tennis. I like being with my family. I love the hours of solitude I manage to get in a day to write. But there is so much more I think about when it comes to society than I actually do. There is so many more ways in which I would like to be involved with many other lives and give my energy and let my energy follow my understanding. But I don't. I fall well short. But I often think about that. So that's I think, and Abhay thinks about it and doesn't do, but I do think about that. That the more we learn, the more we discover, how much more does that oblige us to do? And the people I'm most full of admiration for are people who give greater amounts of energy and kind of follow that understanding and compassion with involvement and engagement and giving their energy and their time, because that is profoundly unselfish and profoundly generous. So.
And one action that Abhay takes is he decides to go to India. Now, I know from seeing you in previous festivals, you don't want me to give away too much of the plot, because it is a real page turner, so we don't want to reveal too much of the plot. But I'm really interested in, this is combining two questions together, when Abhay finally returns to his homeland. And the book is all about rediscovery and looking at memory again and again. And so how does he see India differently? And I thought this might be a good opportunity for you to do that little reading that we talked about.
Right, sure.
But if you'd like to talk a little bit first about, him returning to India and seeing it through new eyes.
Very much.
Before you do the reading. Yeah.
And one of the things I satirize in the book at that point, it's late in the book, without giving anything away, he goes with paranoid eyes. Like, he goes to try and heal this rift that finally it's become too large to deny and too large to look away from, even in faraway Wellington. But he also goes with utterly paranoid eyes, like basically around every shadow in India is his brother's malice, and by extension, all of the dangers that are present in Indian life, and so it's a lot of the kind of humor in the final section is his paranoia. And whether that paranoia will be realized or not, or is justified or not, is what that is about. But the extract that I thought I'd read to you, and Kerry had told me to prepare a 3 or 4 minute extract, is this really, it's quite a funny, and I'll read it with editing out a few spoilers. Is this really funny moment when he's en route from New Zealand to India, and he's actually waiting at a stopover at Bangkok airport. And he starts to speak to, and he's writing notes, and he's full of paranoia, but he's also got this mildly noble wish to heal this rift, to at least address it or come and meet it, begin to take steps towards healing it. And he's addressing a portrait of the Buddha at Bangkok airport. And the only other things you need to know is that he calls the older brother he's about to meet, in Bengali, we call our older brothers Dada. So you'll hear a Dada. Similarly, Didi is an older sister. He mentions a Didi. Meera is his 4-year-old daughter. And Ma is the word for mother. That's all you need to know. So this is Abhay on his way to India, near the end of the book, addressing a portrait of the Buddha at Bangkok airport. Dear Buddha, Sometimes being mindful just ain't enough. I know you strongly refuted all beliefs in any kind of continuous selfhood, and it is profoundly sound advice to let oppressive, mostly fictitious chains of continuity go. But I can't, not unless I've helped Dada slip free of his as well. We are weighed down by the same burden, the same moment in our different stories. As Dada never tired of reminding me, there's perhaps no country better set up than New Zealand for someone of my circumstances to believe that the good life consists of nothing beyond paying attention to the immediate present, which, in my case, is often just the tennis ball I'm about to hit, or the pretend tea party that Mira is hosting, or the sentence I'm trying to sharpen. But how can I turn away from what I've seen of his pain? Surely his release would be mine as well. And then, for me to learn a little more about Didi, if only to find out that much else happened in her adult life that Ma and I cannot feel responsible for. How lucky am I to have so many good life options before me? I could close my eyes to my faraway siblings and practice a narrow Buddhism back home. Or, now that Mira is a few months from starting school, I could act on my resolutions to get involved with refugees, prisoners, and others who it would be rewarding to meet. All the while, keeping a mindful distance from those in my own home I know to be mired in sorrow. Surely that cannot be the path to choose. And then I skip a little bit, which would be a spoiler, and then read. But Buddha, although I'm certain you'll be smiling, there is one disagreement with your teachings that I will respectfully register. It is clearer to me than ever that there are all sorts of continuities which leave their imprints on our bodies, memories, and habits, including forces that form us as we grow, from within and around, but also circumstances that begin their sculpting before we are even born. Both Dada and I are still the boys lost in Howrah, no matter what else we are. I will always be the brother whose birth sealed the loss of my sibling's father. From earliest childhood, I have been encouraged to look away from this fact. Dada is unable to see anything but. So many other habits flow from these. That is my view, Great One. One question I'm traveling to ask is, are new habits possible for us? Is history nothing but entrapment? Meet back here in just under a fortnight? Thank you. Thank you very much.
I just have one question before we'll open up to the floor for questions. And you touch on it a little bit in that reading, and it's about that rediscovery again, but also I'm interested in you telling us what you learnt about memory in the process of writing this book, because it's something that I found fascinating that you explore in a really lively, actual part of the plot is around the, how memory works. So
Yeah. Again, I think one of the things I really wanted to keep alive through the book, and the book is it's got a story flowing right through it, but it also unfolds in the form of episodes and small chapters. And several of those episodes are memories that have been triggered by an incident or incident in the present, leading to reflection and recollection. And I wanted that to be a very kind of dynamic process. And and also kind of like realize, there are things in the middle of the book that he thinks about and things that come back to him from something his brother has said or done. And he's really amazed how he'd either never thought about that in years, despite it being in him, or that he'd never looked at it from that way. And if we had more time, I'd read you instances where either it's something he had consciously held in memory, but had never looked at it from a certain way, or is looking at it from a new way, or things that have been brought to the surface. But it is once they come up to he's amazed that he was able to look away from it. But the other thing is also the extent to which, and he's a writer, and that's why he reflects on this failing in himself, as I do, particularly harshly, which is the extent to which he allowed others to steer his memories. Like his mum, growing up, wanted him to look away from certain unpleasant rifts in their family. And because it made life easier, he just followed her cue. And over time, it just became easier and easier to look away. And
the path of least resistance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the inertia of just continuing. So, and then again, like one of the things that I hope is a very dynamic process with reading the book. Like I said, like that you begin with the idea that you start to feel Ashim, the brother has come with an agenda which is full of malice and disruption. But one of the things that I hope is a very dynamic process throughout the book is through all of the different incidents and that cast this older brother in a different light. I hope your view of him, if you read the book, is a constantly changing one, and that someone who initially appears to be quite openly villainous, your view of him changes and you go, hang on, I've been seeing him entirely through the mediation of my two narrators, and actually if I interpret him independently with all the new evidence that is slowly coming to light through memory, among other things, there's a new light cast on his shadow. And the one last thing, if we have time, I want to talk about is, again, I intended for that to be political with a small p as well, by which I mean often, in India, but elsewhere as well, people who are reasonably well-heeled, even when they allow people who haven't had those advantages before, even when they allow them through legislation, through other things, and through struggle, through fights, through resistance, when the doors of the institutions of privilege are on and the windows are broken open, or the doors are open slightly to allow new voices and new people in a place like India, where such changes are quite slow and there's affirmative action programs, but there's a lot of upper caste resistance. One of the things that's really interesting is the extent to which the highly reluctant upper castes or whatever are sitting there and are waiting to jump in judgment on, within inverted commas, the first sign of bad behavior or not being able to cope with the norms and whatever of their institution. So if someone who's come in through affirmative action is initially struggling academically, or is speaking in too loud a voice of very, simple social norms, they go, see, they don't belong here, or they didn't. And that's one of the themes of this book, which is the idea of this very superficial idea of bad behavior on the part of someone structurally and historically disadvantaged, with very good reasons for having a chip on their shoulder, and structurally and historically excluded from these places. A very superficial notion of bad behavior used to put them back in their place, used to rap them on their knuckles or sit in judgment on them, is something that Abhay, the narrator, kind of also flirts with a lot. Like, Ashim is behaving badly, but that bad behavior has behind it huge structural inequality, unfairness, grievance. But it's really, I don't know if you've noticed it, I often notice it, like very superficial kinds of inappropriate behavior used to judge people entering a new milieu for the first time and kind of say, see, it proves they don't belong here.
Yeah,
Or
yeah, they have to be perfect when they.
yeah.
I think there's a tennis player who got in trouble for some bad behaviour
Yeah,
recently.
exactly. Serena's, that's a great example.
Yeah. So, do we have any questions from the audience? We have a microphone up the front. Thank you.
Absolutely fascinating. You are a
Any
fascinating
questions?
person.
I have more if
Thank
you
you for
don't, but
being in New Zealand.
please open up
And
to
that's
you.
my question.
Anyone
My
who
question
wants
has
to
to
ask
do with
anything?
that. So now, do you feel you belong in both countries? When people ask you, who are you? What do you say? Who are you?
Very much, I do. And also the other places that I've lived, like, very much. And I would say that I feel very grateful to have these two homes currently. And I was back in Britain earlier this year, and I lived there. I lived for 16 years in India and then 14 in Britain. So numerically, it's quite literally my second home. And then New Zealand, I've been here 8 years now. But I feel like not only do I feel very privileged to move back and forth between these two worlds, I feel they bring me very different things for which I'm equally grateful. So, for example, I've spent a lot of this session, and especially if there's anyone of Indian, I spent a lot of this session washing Indian dirty linen in public, amongst non-Indians, which is one of these great unforgivables. You don't, we know these dirty secrets, you don't launder them. But one of the other things I should also say is that living away from one country, in my case it's India, allows you to have a very privileged relationship with that same heritage. So, for example, the things that you love about that heritage, in my case, the mythology, the philosophy, the food, the music, the languages, I can keep close to myself. And all of the things that I have profound problems with, because I live here, I can keep them at a great distance. So I have this selective filter. This distance acts as a selective filter. I can keep the parts of my Indianness that I love and want to pass on immediately to our daughter Leela. I can do so and keep, whereas people who live in India and are raising their children there don't have that luxury. They have to take all of India, the wonderful things and the other things. So that's one privilege I feel. And I also feel like, I feel this, there are parts of me that kind of grew up reacting to those aspects of India that I deeply disagreed with, always. The hierarchy in behavior, the profound inequality of your life outcomes, no matter how hard you work based on where you were born. To live somewhere where things are done differently, where people on the whole try to behave with one another differently, where at least these unequal outcomes are recognized as injustices, and as a society we're that conversation is quite central to our sense of self as a society. How to lessen those inequalities. I feel very grateful to be part of that here. So I definitely draw on. But the writer in me, writers don't like straightforwardness. The person, the person who wants to go and pay their electricity bill, the person who wants to set up a new internet connection, the living person loves New Zealand. It's so easy. You go online, you do it, Whereas in India, setting up an internet connection becomes a 4-day saga, because it's what should be so simple and straightforward. You might not have the right documents. You might have to bribe 2 people. You end up having to wait, and you find out the person you were waiting for 3 hours is the wrong person. The writers love complications and layers and complexity. The living person who wants to get on with stuff really values the clarity of things in New Zealand. The writer loves those details in Indian life. So that's also really interesting. So, writers don't like, it happened really smoothly. That's not a good
thing. Nothing happens.
I think quite a few
Time
of us
for
in
one
this
more
room
question if
have
anyone
several
has one.
homes, having come from different places. And I've just returned from my birth home of Canada, but I've lived here in New Zealand for 42 years. And I was, even though Canada, you would say Canada and New Zealand are quite similar in many ways. There's not the same discrepancies in many ways, but I just found in Canada things are still very complex. You were talking about the internet and the banking and all that, and did you find, I had this tendency to say, oh, but you can do it so easy, like in New Zealand, we do this. And they'll say, oh, no, this is really simple. You know, like there's about an 8-step process to do internet banking. I'm saying, oh, but all you have to do,
Right.
do you see yourself trying to correct things when you go to India?
Right.
I felt
Right.
really embarrassed because I was it's sort of a holier than thou attitude. Oh, but we know how to do it right in New Zealand. And we are very, very, very early adapters to new technology. When you go back to India,
Right,
do you
right.
try to, do you feel sometimes that you're holier
Right,
than thou?
right.
You know what that expression is, eh? Like,
Well, I think, and my friends kind of mock me for. Yeah. Well, I think, and my friends kind of mock me for it and get angry with me, and also get annoyed with me in India. Like, I think when I go to India, because I now only go once or twice a year, I kind of very much, and the writer in me and the person who loves watching human life in all its forms, very much is kind of like, this is the Indian way. I'll try the straightforward way, but if it doesn't, and often people are just so taken aback that I'm approaching them straightforwardly, it works. But in lots of ways, I just kind of go, I'm in India now, and I want things to unfold in that way. And what my friends tell me, and family members who get annoyed tell me, it's all very well for you because you've got a return ticket in your pocket. So this doesn't irritate you, and it really frustrates us when we live here. And of course, like, you know, to put you to the bigger challenges that come when you live there. And, you know, whereas for me, it's just this thing where I can observe how India would do something, and it's an interesting experience for me, but I'm like, thankfully, where I live most of the time, it's much simpler. But no, there's one more thing I did want to say, which is slightly unrelated, but it is an interest. I would say that, I would hate to say that relative to India, for me, and you know, not having grown up, relative to a place, certain kinds of complexity, certain kinds of layering seem less apparent here, you know? But that's only, first thing I'd say is that it's only relative to India. And the second thing I would say is that, you know, your artistic skill in no matter what art form you practice is challenged by different environments in different ways. And New Zealand no less than India. So for example, one of the things I always say to people who are arriving in India and taking photographs, and especially friends who are photographers from elsewhere and then want to post those photographs, one of the few things I always say is, by all means, photograph whatever comes to your eye, especially if it's your first time and for the first couple of days, but don't start posting all your photographs immediately, because, you know, things that leap out at you in the beginning, within a couple of days, as being either weird or grotesque or unusual, within a couple of days, you'll realize they've found their place within Indian life, and they'll start to see, you know, don't photograph and post the first cow you see at a traffic light, you know, because you'll see 5,000 more, and you'll just... So what I would like to say is that in India, somewhere like India, the danger for the artist is to fall into that trap of exoticizing and these kind of, within inverted commas, these larger than life things. Whereas, you know, in New Zealand, you know, walking down a street, most streets, is relatively a much more straightforward process with much less external stimuli bombarding you. But that doesn't mean the stories aren't there. And so the challenge for the artist here is to notice the stories that don't jump out at you quite so much. The challenge for the artist in India is to resist the superficial temptation of posting every story that's jumping out at you immediately as being, you know, I find really interesting as well, living in two places, is that they pose different challenges to the person struggling to depict. So
That's a great note to end it on. I think you'll all agree that Raj is a fantastic storyteller and a superb observer of people and life. So thank you very
It's a
much
pleasure.
for
And also
being with us
thank you so
today.
much for coming. I'm so delighted. And once again, just wanted to apologize for beginning with such a harrowing crime patrol story.